Hello, and thank you. So I prepared some slides. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover or a conference by its title, but I did a little bit of that. I'm going to present a few slides on a project that it started a little bit serendipitously because you might not remember this, but about 6 years ago, Chile underwent a revolution that, it started very, it started very normally at the beginning. It was just a protest for, the increase in prices in the subway system, and that escalated into like almost like a full-blown, war and battle in Santiago that started a new constitutional, process that then eventually, failed. But I wanted to focus on something that we did at the very moment that this revolution started, which was, about the year 2018, on October 2018, because this revolution was one that was described as a network social movement. These are social movements that we've observed across the world. These are movements that can grow very big, but it's very unclear what they want. They usually distrust political parties, they distrust traditional media, they reject leadership, they reject formal forms of organization, and therefore you have a lot of people that are mobilized and you don't really know why. So what we did at that time when, the revolution had just started is, we said, well, let's do what we know how to do, which is to build platforms for collective intelligence. Maybe we can find things that people from the left and the right agree on, and maybe if we find those things, we could channel the dialogue towards something more constructive. So we started working on this at a basement in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We literally launched a platform from one day to the next. It was very stressful because this was a platform that when we launched it became extremely popular. I think to this date is the digital democracy experience that has enjoyed the largest level of participation in the world. We eventually got about 7 million preferences from the population. And the design was a design that was quite simple. It's based on the idea of pair comparisons. This is an idea that was introduced by Leon Thurstone in the 1920s, but that is very popular on the web and is used even today to train large language models, which is to present pairs of options and ask users to click on an option in response to the pair. So this allowed us to run like 4,000 elections in parallel, like 4,000 head-to-head elections in parallel. And here the options were not candidates, but they were actually policy proposals that we were trying to use to figure out what were the grievances that were driving the mobilization. So we did a platform that was, successful at the beginning. It was being discussed on newspapers, on TV, and all of that. And we were able to discover that there were some grievances that were shared by the population, like the minimum wage or VAT taxes on medicine, or, for example, jail for collusion crimes, because in Chile those had become very important. And we also found that there were some policy items that were not relevant. But after about 3 weeks, basically, people turned against us, and they didn't like what we were doing, in part because some of them thought that what was coming out of this project was not aligned with what they thought was the perspective of the world. So we started to ask what was going on. We were a group of people that worked really hard with good intentions to create a platform to find things that people agreed on. We find things that people agreed on, and people eventually turned against us. And that brought me to this chart, which then I used the data that we had collected plus a small survey that was self-reported that was running on the platform to now run rankings that were separate from the people that self-reported as being from the left and self-reported as being from the right. And what was interesting about this chart is that you see, of course, there is a good correlation, meaning that there is a large area of agreement, but the elements that are outside of the correlation are, some of them are like really outside the correlation. So if you look up here, the one that says Asamblea Constituyente, this means a constitutional assembly. This is an item that among people from the left, it was on the top 5, maybe number 2 or 3, and it was on the very bottom among people that self-identify from the right. So what this started to tell us is that despite the fact that there's an area of agreement, there's these issues that deviate from the diagonal, and that issues that are divisive. So then I moved to France in 2020, and we reproduced this using the French presidential election, the Brazilian presidential election. We rephrased this project as a collaborative government program builder. So we extracted the proposals from the government programs of all of the candidates, and we're able to, again, find this divisiveness and show that this was a multidimensional phenomena. So for instance, when you look at people from the left and the right in France, the people from the left, they want to prohibit large salary gaps. If you look at younger versus older people care much more about real estate taxes. They want to reduce those. But you don't need demographic characteristics to characterize divisiveness. So actually, you can use the voting data itself to create a bootstrap version of divisiveness that you can calculate, and that has become an interesting topic in social choice theory. So our original idea was to build a collective intelligence platform that would help us find a consensus and support a constructive dialogue. That was a naive idea, because what we found out was what driving the revolution was not things that people agreed universally that were important, was things that some people thought were important and other people thought were the last thing they wanted, to support. It was this disagreement, the one that was at the core. And unfortunately, traditional voting rules are not able to capture that information. This is an orthogonal dimension to that. And since then, we have been moving more towards this direction of LLMs, in which now, we have been exploring the use of large language models and AI to augment democracy. So just to conclude, this is a growing area of research for anybody interested in augmented democracy and digital democracy. And if you're interested in what we do more generally, this is our group's page, the Center for Collective Learning here in Toulouse and in Budapest.